Why could 2026 become a decisive year for the world? For decades, people imagined World War III as a sudden nuclear apocalypse. Missiles crossing the skies and cities disappearing in seconds. But what if the next global conflict doesn't look like that at all? What if the world is already entering a new kind of war? One that is slower, more complex, and far more unpredictable. Throughout my career, which began in the 1960s, I've reported on more than 40 wars across the world. I witnessed the Cold War rise to its peak and then slowly fade away. But I have never seen a year as alarming as 2025, not only because several major conflicts are happening right now, but because one of them could reshape global geopolitics in ways we have never seen before. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has warned that the war in his country could escalate into a global conflict. After nearly 60 years covering wars and international crises, I have an uneasy feeling he might be right. Governments within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, are now on high alert. Any sign that Russia might be cutting the undersea cables that carry the electronic traffic keeping their nations running is treated as a serious threat. Russian drones are accused of probing NATO defenses, testing how far they can go. At the same time, hackers are developing new ways to shut down ministries, emergency services, and major corporations. Western officials are also convinced that Russian intelligence services have carried out, or attempted, assassinations against dissidents who sought refuge outside Russia. One investigation focused on the 2018 poisoning in Salisbury, England, targeting former Russian intelligence officer Sergei Skripal. The attack also led to the fatal poisoning of a local resident, Dawn Sturgis. Investigators later concluded that the operation was authorized at the highest level of the Russian state. In other words, by Russia's own president, Vladimir Putin. This time, it feels different. The year 2025 has been marked by three very different wars. First, there is the war in Ukraine, where the United Nations says more than 14,000 civilians have already lost their lives. Then there is Gaza. After the Hamas attack on Israel on October the 7th, 2023, which left around 1,200 people dead and 251 taken hostage, Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, promised what he called a powerful revenge. Since then, more than 70,000 Palestinians have died in Israeli military operations. According to Gaza's health ministry, which is controlled by Hamas, the victims include more than 30,000 women and children, figures that the United Nations considers credible. And meanwhile, far from the headlines, Sudan is being torn apart by a brutal civil war between rival military factions. In just 2 years, more than 150,000 people have died, and nearly 12 million have been forced to flee their homes. Perhaps if this had been the only conflict of 2025, the outside world might have done more to stop it. But that was not the case. "I'm good at ending wars," said the President of the United States, Donald Trump, as his plane headed toward Israel after negotiating a ceasefire in the fighting in Gaza. It is true that fewer people are dying there now, but despite the ceasefire, the war in Gaza is still far from resolved. And yet, amid the unimaginable suffering in the Middle East, it may sound strange to say that the war in Ukraine exists on an entirely different level. But it does. I'm not going to start the Third World War for you, with the exception of the Cold War, which lasted from 1947 to 1991. Most of the conflicts I covered as a journalist over the years were smaller in scale. They were violent and dangerous, without question, but not severe enough to threaten global peace. Some wars, like the Vietnam War, the First Gulf War, and the Kosovo War, at times appeared to be on the brink of something far worse. Yet none of them ever crossed that line. The world's great powers were simply too cautious, aware that even a localized conventional war could spiral into a nuclear conflict. In 1999, during the Kosovo War, British General Sir Mike Jackson reportedly shouted over the radio to a NATO superior, who had ordered British and French forces to seize an airport in Pristina after Russian troops had arrived first. I'm not going to start the Third World War for you. But in the coming year, 2026, the situation may be changing. Russia, sensing what it perceives as a lack of interest from Donald Trump toward Europe, now appears willing to push for far greater dominance. Earlier this month, Vladimir Putin said that Russia does not plan to go to war with Europe, but he also warned that the country is ready right now if Europeans want it. In a later televised event, he added, "There will be no operations if you treat us with respect. If you respect our interests, just as we have always tried to respect yours." But Russia, one of the world's major powers, has already invaded an independent European country, causing a massive number of deaths among both civilians and soldiers. Ukraine accuses Moscow of abducting at least 20,000 children. The International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin over his alleged involvement in the case, an accusation the Russian government strongly denies. Moscow insists the invasion was launched to protect itself from NATO's expansion. But President Putin has also suggested another motive: the desire to restore Russia's sphere of influence across the region. American disapproval. Vladimir Putin is fully aware that the past year, 2025, brought something most Western nations once considered unthinkable: the possibility of a US president turning his back on the strategic system that has defined the Western alliance since the end of World War II. The United States has not only shown uncertainty about its willingness to defend Europe, it has also openly expressed disapproval of the direction it believes the continent is taking. The new National Security Strategy report, released by the Trump administration, warns that Europe now faces what it calls a grim prospect of civilizational erasure. The Russian government welcomed the document, saying it aligns closely with Russia's own worldview. And in many ways, it does. Inside Russia, according to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the country, Putin has largely silenced internal opposition to both his government and the war in Ukraine. Yet despite this control, challenges remain. Inflation could rise again after a period of slowdown. Oil revenues are declining, and the government has been forced to raise taxes to help finance the war. The economies of the European Union are roughly 10 times larger than Russia's. And if the United Kingdom is included, the gap becomes even greater. Europe's combined population, around 450 million people, is more than 3 times larger than Russia's estimated 145 million. Yet despite these advantages, Western Europe has often shown reluctance to give up its comforts, and until recently, it hesitated to bear the true cost of its own defense, as long as it could rely on American protection. But the United States has also changed. It has become less globally dominant, more inward-looking, and increasingly different from the country I observed throughout most of my career. In many ways, it now echoes the America of the 1920s and 1930s, a nation focused primarily on its own national interests. Even if Donald Trump were to lose significant political power in next year's congressional elections, the debate may have already shifted too far toward isolationism. So much so that even a future American president, one more aligned with NATO in 2028, might struggle to come to Europe's aid. And make no mistake, Vladimir Putin has certainly noticed the risk of escalation. The coming year, 2026, could prove decisive. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, may eventually be forced to accept a peace agreement that would require giving up a significant portion of Ukrainian territory. The real question is whether any agreement could include guarantees strong enough to prevent Vladimir Putin from advancing again, just a few years later. For Ukraine, and for its European allies, who already feel they are effectively at war with Russia, this question is critical. Europe will likely have to take on a far greater share of the burden to sustain Ukraine. But if the United States ultimately turns its back on the country, something it has occasionally threatened to do, the cost could be enormous, But could this war eventually escalate into a nuclear confrontation? We know that Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, is a gambler. A more cautious leader might never have ordered the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Some of his allies have made terrifying threats, claiming that Russia's new and highly publicized weapons could wipe the United Kingdom and other European countries off the map. Yet Putin himself has usually been far more restrained. As long as the United States remains an active member of NATO, the risk of a devastating American nuclear response remains far too high, at least for now. China's global role. In China, President Xi Jinping has made few direct threats recently toward the self-governed island of Taiwan. But 2 years ago, the former director of the CIA, William Burns, revealed that Xi had instructed the People's Liberation Army to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. If China fails to take decisive action to claim Taiwan, Xi may see that as a sign of weakness, something he cannot afford. Today, China may appear too powerful and too wealthy to worry about domestic public opinion, but that is not entirely true. Since the uprising that culminated in the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, Chinese leaders have monitored public reaction with almost obsessive attention. I witnessed those events firsthand, reporting from Beijing and, at times, even living in the square itself. The year 2026 could be decisive. China's power will likely continue to grow, and Xi Jinping's strategy toward Taiwan, his greatest geopolitical ambition, may become much clearer. The war in Ukraine could end, but possibly on terms favorable to Vladimir Putin. If that happens, he may feel free to advance again into Ukrainian territory whenever he sees the opportunity. And Donald Trump, even if weakened politically after congressional elections, may continue pulling the United States further away from Europe. From a European perspective, the outlook could hardly be darker. If you imagined World War III as a massive nuclear confrontation, it may be time to think again. The next global conflict is far more likely to unfold through diplomatic pressure, military maneuvering, and the gradual expansion of authoritarian power. A shift that could weaken, or even fracture, the Western alliance itself, and in many ways, that process has already begun.
The world is changing faster than many expected. Global powers are repositioning, alliances are shifting, and conflicts are spreading across multiple regions. The next global confrontation may not begin with nuclear explosions, but with strategy, influence, and power. And in many ways, it may have already begun.